I apologize. I will read the paper in English, and I was left too long with my paper, so even I can't understand what's written. So, okay. So, elephants depicted carrying structures on their backs have been recorded in 18th century Eastern and Central European synagogues. In Chodorov, Wojciech, Jablonov, Michalpol, Minkowce, and Yarishev in Poland, and in the synagogues of Hof and Unterlimburg in Germany. Some of the elephants were depicted heading east, others went westwards or to the south. In some of the synagogues, a single elephant was painted, while in others they were depicted in pairs. However, the elephants in all synagogues shared some mutual characteristics. One of the most prominent is the structures on their backs. In marked contrast to the military fortresses which were painted on the backs of most elephants in other European artistic sources, Jewish and Christian, the structures on the backs of the painted elephants in synagogues were depicted as non-military structures. By far, researchers tried to decipher the iconographic context of the elephant motif based on the elephant's famous virtues of wisdom, strength, and piety, already mentioned by old Pliny, ignoring the shape of the structures on their backs and their orientations. I suggest that the iconographic context of the structure carrying elephant motif is manifested in the design of the structure, as well as in their orientation toward painted settlements and towns in the same synagogues. According to these two criteria, these elephants could be considered vehicles carrying sacred buildings back to Jerusalem. The shapes of structures on the backs of 8 elephants documented can be divided into 2 major groups. Elephants painted in the early 18th century synagogues, which bear a large, domed, elaborate edifice, and elephants painted in the late 18th century synagogues, which carry small, simple structures. Some elements of structures painted on the backs of elephants in the Chodorov, Wojciech, Jablonov, Hof, and Unterlimburg synagogues suggest the Jerusalem temple. Something went wrong here. I just have to reload the image. Will be better. Okay, now it works. Yes. So one of these characteristics are dome covering a symmetrical structure. This type of design was typical to visual descriptions of the Jerusalem temple in Jewish and Christian paintings in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. For example, in the Nuremberg Chronicle painted in 1493. Large domes were painted on top of the structures in the Gvojic, Jablonov, and Unterlimpurg synagogue. In the Hope synagogue, a three-story building was depicted, but you can see it here. But additionally, on its roof, a small dome was added. The structure on the Chodorov, painted in the Chodorov synagogue featured a rectangular roof. You can see it here on the right. However, this synagogue also contained a different feature common in early modern literal description of the Jerusalem temple: pavilions on both sides of the structure. According to Rabbi Yom Tov Lippman Heller, author of the famous Tosfot Yom Tov commentary to the Mishnah, pavilions were built on the sides of the temple. Two marginal pavilions also flanked the domed edifices painted in the Jablonov and the Unterlimpurg synagogues. Two domes were painted in the Gvojic synagogue, with the rear dome larger than and higher. This may depict a narrow side of the similar structure consisting of two side pavilions and a central dome. Hence, all five structures depicted on the backs of elephants in the earlier synagogue bear some resemblance to medieval and early modern period depictions of the Jerusalem temple. The structures depicted on elephants' backs in Michalpol, Minkovce, and Yerishev synagogues were smaller and simpler. They resemble buildings in depictions of settlement painted in the very same synagogue, surrounded by the body of an Ouroboros, a marine creature biting its own tail. In the Mohilev synagogue, a town mounted on a similar creature represented the town of Worms. Hence, while the identity and purpose of the small buildings carried by elephants remained uncertain, it is quite clear that they once belonged to these diaspora settlements. In each of the synagogues of Chodorov and Gvojic, two elephants carrying structures were painted on the southern and on the northern walls, facing the eastern wall, thus forming an imaginary triangle along with the Torah ark. Mark Michael Epstein argues that these elephants represented the Torah itself, or a powerful force protecting it. However, in all other synagogues, only one elephant was painted, and its orientation varied. In the Hope synagogue, for example, the elephant faced the western wall. In the Jablonov synagogue, it was headed south. However, there was a similarity between the elephants' orientations. In most of these synagogues, the elephants headed toward a large, impressive city, presumably Jerusalem. In both Chodorov and Gvojic synagogue, the elephant faced the eastern wall, where such a town was depicted. In the Jablonov synagogue, the elephant was painted on the western wall, opposite to a city painted on the eastern wall. Foxes were painted underneath the city, apparently inspired by the Talmudic story in which sages saw a fox eating the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple. In the Minkovce synagogue, The elephant was depicted above a small settlement surrounded by an Ouroboros, facing a large walled city with a high gate and splendorous buildings. Hence, this elephant's location above a diaspora town, facing a town surrounded by a large gate, apparently Jerusalem, suggests transportation of the structure from the diaspora to Jerusalem. In the Hope Synagogue, the elephant was facing a large town depicted on the western wall. The painter wrote the city's name explicitly, Jerusalem. In this synagogue, the painter's intention of transferring the structure on the elephant's back to Jerusalem is clearly demonstrated by several means. First, as already mentioned, the elephant faces the western wall where the city of Jerusalem was depicted. Secondly, this elephant differs from the majority of synagogue elephants as it is dynamic, marching vigorously, not standing statically in place. Moreover, in contrast to all the elephants painted in earlier synagogues, it is not framed by any decorative element. Therefore, its movement is fluent and free of distractions. Hence, although depicted far from the western wall, this elephant appears determined to deliver its cargo to Jerusalem. In this synagogue, the design of the structure also illustrates the connection between the structure on the elephant's back and the Jerusalem temple. The peculiar perspective reveals three of its facades simultaneously. The painter Eliezer Zussman had already employed this type of perspective in his illustration of the Jerusalem temple produced 3 years earlier in the Bechhofen synagogue. Despite the latter's splendid appearance indicated by a large gate in its central facade, this building could also be interpreted as a residential house. This is indicated by the rows of windows on the right facade, also depicted similarly in the Hope Synagogue. And lastly, unlike other synagogues he decorated, in the Hope Synagogue, Eliezer Zussman did not depict the temple inside the city of Jerusalem. Instead, he left a gap between two elaborate towers where he wrote the letters Bet and Hey, which stand for Bet HaMikdash, the temple, as in other works of his. The missing temple should probably be depicted somewhere else in the synagogue paintings. The structure on the elephant's back could fit this purpose. For centuries, Jews referred to the synagogue as Mikdash Me'at, a portion of a temple. This reference was based on the verse, "Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, although I send them far away among the nations and scatter them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary, Mikdash Me'at, for them in the countries where they have gone. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again." The combination of these three scriptural themes, the diaspora, the synagogue, and national redemption, might portray the anticipated return of the synagogue to the land of Israel, along with human worshippers. Therefore, it is not improbable that the synagogue painter's intent was to depict elephants carrying buildings resembling Jerusalem of the diaspora settlements back to Jerusalem. Also, according to the literal interpretation of Rabbi Elazar Kapar, saying, the synagogues and study halls of Babylonia will be planted in Eretz Israel in era to come. In conclusion, as I demonstrated, to decipher the motif on an elephant carrying a structure on its back it must be analyzed in the context of other interior paintings in the synagogue. Synagogue paintings are like complex content arrays, puzzles, which require several keys to unlock. Although the elephant is an eye-catching zoomorphic motif which attracted the attention of several notable scholars in Jewish art, I propose that an important previously unrecognized key to interpreting the paintings on the elephants in synagogues is the structure on the back and its orientation towards the city of Jerusalem. Apparently, elephants were chosen as a vehicle to carry these sacred buildings back to Jerusalem due to the renowned traits of strength and piety. In painting of the elephants, synagogue painters used Christian art as visual models and followed their conventions. However, in regards to the structures, they developed novel perceptions. In contrast to the fortresses painted on the backs of most elephants in Christian art, synagogue painters chose to depict elephants as carrying residential structures. They based their design on prior artistic depictions of the Jerusalem temple to indicate sacred buildings, apparently synagogues. Analysis of the orientation of all documented elephants painting in the synagogues revealed that most of them faced the representation of Jerusalem. Therefore, in most synagogues, the elephant could be considered vehicles carrying sacred buildings back to Jerusalem. This illustration may represent yearning for the days of Messiah and the return to the land of Israel, not only of individuals and congregations, but also of their communal institutions. Thank you.